these two either side. That's the important factor. The more important, anybody who needs a toilet, through the double doors, through the single door, go to the end and turn left on the right. Please feel free to use it. Hey, to you, Nick. Thank you.
Well, I've been a member of Otford Methodist for just a short time, but I picked up from various of your sermons something about your early life, and I've seen a brief biography, but I'm sure there are other people who know you far better, so we will leave time at the end for other friends who they've got questions that I have missed or would like to pick you up on any of your answers. So there will be time at the end, so just bear in mind, yes, I would like to ask him that. So let's go back to your early life. We are always very, very aware that it's rather further north than here. And it was in Skelmersdale in Lancashire, which changed from a little village in the country to a major development with rehousing from Liverpool. That must have had a huge impact, that change.
It was a large village. Behind the house where I lived, there was a dairy farm, and there were cows, which sometimes came in the garden, ate my dad's veg. And actually, it was quite an intimate community. Within a short time, just a few years, they built a new town to take people from Liverpool. And the field behind, they put about 500 houses. And if ever you visit Skem, one of the things you'll notice is they don't have potholes. They put in a fantastic road system expecting a huge quantity of traffic, and it never materialised. So there's lots of dual carriageways, but the factories they're expecting, there's factories there but not as busy. For me, the biggest impact was schooling. I went to a school which I really enjoyed. And then they built this new school that my parents thought would be really nice. It's near the house. It was terrible. And when I went to senior school, I was surrounded. It was the second year of the school opening, and there were 1,200 teenagers, the majority of whom were from Liverpool. And when they moved the communities from Liverpool, they didn't make them into the same communities in Skem. They just kind of brought all these people together. And bullying and aggression and unpleasantness, and it was just awful.
And but you started with an idyllic school.
My memories of the early time are really very pleasant. Yeah. And the friends I had at that school didn't go on into the next school.
So from school you went into an apprenticeship. What career were you anticipating at that stage?
In my imagination, I was going to become an electrician. The company I worked for taught as electricians bricklaying, plastering, plumbing. And the idea was they would send the electrician to a job, and everything that needed doing, that man could do. And my plan was to buy a house, renovate it, sell it, and buy another one, and get into a pattern. But the plans didn't work. I came into a different kind of building.
So you actually focused on the electricity side?
Yes.
Yeah. And you had no faith at this point, and I get the impression that God had to work rather hard to get your attention.
My parents were quite, I think as youngsters they became Christians, but then they became quite liberal and not very interested, and we would go on a Sunday morning occasionally. And when I was 16, I started my apprenticeship. That was it. It was just, church was boring, I wasn't going to go. But the electricity board where I worked, they had different training establishments, and you met different people in each one. In Chorley, there was a man, a 16-year-old like me, called Jeff. And in Wigan, there was Jim. They were both Christians. They didn't know each other, but they both targeted me. And so over that 3 years, they were talking to me, not knowing about the other person, but actually it was having an impact. Jeff admitted later that he'd given up on me because I just seemed to be getting more aggressive with him. But that was because actually I was reacting to what they were telling me.
You mentioned in a sermon recently that you had a very significant accident.
I wrote my motorbike off. Yeah. I was in Capel Currig, and we were on a camping holiday in a caravan. There were 4 of us, and David and I went off into the mountains. And on the way back, we were going through a wood, and at the bottom there was a right-hand bend. As I went round the bend, I was distracted, and rather than straightening the bike up, I hit the curb, and the bike was written off. It bounced down the road, and I bounced down the road after it. I wasn't very badly injured. I cut my knee and bruised, but no bones are broken. And the hospital was very different then, because they actually kept me in for a week. And I was just a knee bandaged up for a week. I was there. And it's while I was there, I think, that God started something, because every bed, it was a ward with beds down either end, and everyone had a Gideon's Bible except mine. And it's that kind of thing that if you've got something I haven't got, I want what you've got. And I had to ask a nurse, and I can tell by the look on her face, she was a bit askance when I said, can I pass that Bible? But I started reading John's Gospel. And a Welsh postman who was in there with a broken arm, which you don't see very often today, he came and started talking to me about John's Gospel. And it was very clear, looking back, that it was part of a pattern.
It's interesting, just for completeness, you didn't mention in your sermon, you didn't mention now, but I think I heard Catherine say that the distraction you mentioned was a pretty girl.
It was, yes.
just for completeness and honesty. But obviously God was very active in that week in hospital. But not everyone can date their conversion to Jesus Christ, which you can do. Mm-hmm. But it was a year later. What happened between that week in hospital and the year later?
I'm not sure. I can tell you what happened the weekend. On the weekend that I became a Christian, I went to Southport with some friends, and we actually got very drunk. And the next morning, don't worry, I mean, if you knew me, you'd understand that. But the next morning I went home, and I was hungover. And my mum was a bit annoyed, really. But then Jim, the lad from Wigan, turned up at the house with his girlfriend, who I'd never met before, and he just said to me, God told me to come. Which, I mean, if you knew Jim, that's a fairly typical comment, but it's a really weird kind of comment. And I didn't want them there, and they knew I didn't want them there. And I think I was embarrassed, and they were embarrassed, but they stayed a few minutes and then left. But as they left, I was closing the door, and Carol's final comment was, Jesus wants you. And I compare that to a fisherman casting his line, and when he feels the fish bite, he tugs it to get the hook into the mouth. And I think that was God hooking me, because I couldn't get those words out of my mind. And that night when I went to bed, it just kept going all the time, really restless, difficult. And in the end, I just got out of bed and asked Jesus to take my life.
That's interesting, because I mentioned some people can't even date their conversion. You can give us a time, 23:15.
Yeah, on the 26th of September 1976. And nothing's ever been the same since. I mean, the next morning when I woke up, I went to work, and foul language was normal. You know, it was just part of everyday conversation. And I realised at lunchtime I hadn't sworn once, and I felt very calm. And when I left that job to go to college, I was working with a colleague, and we were working in two houses, and it was electricity boards. We were installing a power cable. And as I was lifting some boards, I hit my knee with the hammer really hard, and it hurt. And I didn't know the homeowner was standing behind me. And later on, Ken, who I was working with, was chatting to the house owner and told him I was going to college. And he said, I knew there was something about him. And then he told him about this incident with the knee and the hammer. And he said, I knew there was something. He didn't swear. And that to me was just a kind of little, I don't know, the first thing.
I mean, you stayed with the electricity board for another 6 years, I think, and yet you started training as a lay preacher within a year. Again, that's very quick work.
I knew, I don't know if you've ever had this feeling that there's something you have to do, and try as you can, you cannot find what it is you have to do. And I was really struggling with this. And every time the church announced they needed helpers with something, I'd volunteer, and it never got rid of this feeling. And I really struggled with it. And then one evening I walked into my bedroom from work at parents' home, and I just got on my knees and I said, God, if you show me what you want me to do, I'll do it. That was a Tuesday or a Wednesday. The following Sunday evening at 7 o'clock, the service ended. I walked out of the church. I was walking down the road, evening like this, my jacket over my shoulder, and a man ran after me and he said, John, have you ever thought of preaching? I then discovered that all this time I'd been hassled and troubled and working, the local preachers were praying for me, were praying as whether they should ask me or not. And that was the start of it.
One of the blessings of being a lay preacher is that you preached at Catherine's church and got to know her.
Yep. Well, actually, I preached at Catherine's mum's church, and her mum went home and said, we've had this really nice young man. But then she said, he's not as nice as Trevor. Trevor was the boyfriend, Howard, sorry. He's not as nice as Howard, which was a previous boyfriend.
But am I right in saying that she was very clear she didn't want to be the wife of a minister?
We got married, and I said I felt this calling, and she just said no. I do not want to be the wife of a minister. And to be honest, who could blame her, really? And at that point, I wasn't going to argue. And I just said to God, on my own, she wasn't there, I just said, God, if you want this, then you've got to sort this out.
You were married in July 1979, which, if people are working their calculations, you've got a fairly important anniversary next month, a sapphire, I think. Now, 3 years later, you left the electricity board to start ministerial training. What did Catherine think?
By that time, actually, she was quite resolved to it. And we were both, because of the circumstances, she was quite excited by it. We both were, and we really enjoyed college.
It's interesting you said we, because it's very clear that she's very happy for you to be a minister, but also happy to share that responsibility.
Yes. All the time I've been a minister, slightly different in the army, but all the time, Catherine has shared in the pastoral side of ministry. And so often when I go visiting, Catherine would come. And I don't think either of us always enjoyed the churches we've been at, but she's always been part of it, and she's never not wanted to be. So.
Your first appointment as a church minister was the wrong side of the Pennines. You went over to West Yorkshire. You were still in your 20s, and this is a massive responsibility for a young man, the responsibility of the people in your care, teaching, encouraging, challenging. Very young. How did you cope?
Every church wants a young minister with a family, and we were the perfect ones. We had our first child in that first appointment, and the 4 churches I had really were very supportive and around us, but it was really boring. I don't mean to be rude, but it was extremely boring. And the chair of district said to me, the first appointment you're told where you're going to go. And the chair of district had an interview with me, and he wanted to know what kind of ministry I would like next. I had no idea. I really had no idea what I'd want. The people, there's a rivalry between Yorkshire and Lancashire, but actually they're all exactly the same. I've come to the conclusion all Northerners are awkward, really, being here. But no, it was, and I couldn't say to him what I wanted. Do you want me to tell the story of the army?
Well, it's interesting. You say it's boring, and yet I get the impression that it was that period of time when it was quite a heavy challenge. It was a big challenge.
Well, you see, if you listen to a preacher, and at the end of it, that was really good, but nothing changes, the sermon wasn't really good. It entertained you, but it didn't actually have an impact. And I was in 4 churches that didn't want to move. And it was very clear they didn't want to move. They were quite content the way they were. And so I felt I was struggling to try and motivate people, and they didn't want to be motivated. And when I say boring, I don't mean sitting there going and twiddling my thumbs. I actually was working very hard, but didn't think I was getting anywhere.
And you were blaming yourself?
An added thing into that was that I'm quite conservative in the way I view the Bible. And I was constantly being picked up by colleagues. I was a probationer, and ordained colleagues, more older colleagues, were constantly challenging me on the Bible and what I thought and what I believed. And they were very critical. And I actually recognized in my preaching ministry that I was toning it down not to get that kind of reaction. And so I was starting to feel guilty because I just didn't feel I was doing. And I think it's part of the reason of that. When I moved from there, part of me was thinking, could I continue in the ministry if this is what's going to be happening? And I did move from there. And somebody gave me a tape of a Bible teacher. And I listened to this Bible teacher, and he was saying exactly what I was. The compromise, the toning things down. I thought, blow this, I'm just going to preach scripture. And actually, because of the new environment, it worked. Mm-hmm. And since then, that's it, I won't go back. It's
After 4 years in what you might call conventional ministry, you went into the army. Was that out of the frying pan into the fire?
Yes, it was. A friend of mine was doing a mission, and he invited this speaker to come. And he then discovered that on the night he was invited, lots of things were happening in Wakefield, and no one was going to the meeting. And I had exactly the same with Social Responsibility Committee. My secretary rang up and said, John, there's nobody coming. So I cancelled it. And then as I walked into the room and said, Catherine, the meeting's cancelled, she groaned. And she then said, why don't you go and support David? It was a Wednesday evening, Emmerdale was about to start, and she didn't want me there. So I went to listen, and the man she'd invited was an army chaplain. And as he talked about his work, I really did feel a sense of excitement. And on the way home from Pontefract to Normanton, I said to God, I was talking in the car, I said, God, Catherine's never going to agree to this. But when I told her, she said, that sounds like something you might enjoy. Why don't you look into it? And so I did. And actually, we really enjoyed the army, but there were real low points. I mean, she spent, I think, 3 6-month tours on her own, looking after 2 toddlers. We had tours in Germany, Northern Ireland. I was away on exercise a lot. And actually, she coped really well.
And part of that was not just the pressure on Catherine, but part of that time, Georgina, your youngest, your daughter, had quite serious health issues.
She started waking up in the night. I think she was 5 or 6 at the time, and she was crying in pain. And we couldn't touch her. And we took her to the army doctor, and he just said, it's attention-seeking, ignore it. And he just kept saying this. And the regiment I was with had a different doctor. And over lunch, I was talking to him, and he just said, bring her to me. And I took her to David. And he then referred her to a specialist. And she was diagnosed with chronic juvenile arthritis. And she was in really chronic pain. We went to a specialist. Now, within the week, we saw a specialist, and the pain was gone. She was given the medicine. We were warned there would be side effects, her teeth would rot, all kinds of things, but it would cut the pain. Well, her teeth didn't rot, and they were very quickly able to correct it. The school where she was at actually arranged to have ramps put in for a wheelchair. It wasn't necessary. And if you saw her now, she's very fit, very healthy.
With the times, those long times when Catherine was on her own, the problem with Georgina, how did you cope? Did you feel you were in the wrong place?
I don't know how we coped. I mean, it's like we've lived in 2 manses that have flooded. I mean, the first one we were out of the house 6 or 7 months, and this one 8 months. We've had a burglary here. All I can say is that when these things happen, we just respond to it. There's no anxiety in the sense of breaking down. We just somehow, it's a resilience. It's not human. And yeah, we get on and we look back sometimes and think, how did we cope with that? But at the time, we just get on with it.
Now, there may be people who've been in the military but who will know this, but what does a chaplain do?
Well, if you were to talk to the squatty, he walks around drinking tea, not doing very much. We have churches. We run Bible studies, we do baptisms, and when you're in somewhere like Germany or Northern Ireland, the squatty's family have access to the army church, so if they want baptisms or anything of that kind, it's the padre they go to. We do funerals. When a soldier is killed in action or accident, it has a massive impact on the regiment, and you're very busy working with young men who've never really thought about death. It might sound strange. And they cope with it in all different ways, and the padre is a point of contact. We do the routine things of just visiting. In Germany, you're also responsible for the expats, because the expats turn up at the church on a Sunday because they don't speak German, and we do the English. So we visit them and keep in touch with them and do things. And also, if the unit goes on exercise, I go with them. And on exercise, you spend time with the soldiers. You deal with personal problems, difficulties you have, family problems. You're the link back to the barracks. So if something's wrong with the family, they communicate to the soldier through the padre and vice versa. And it's just lots of little things which are really kind of difficult to kind of pin down.
The Apostle Paul, writing to Timothy about the responsibilities of Christian ministers, says, preach the word, be prepared in season and out of season, correct, rebuke and encourage. Now, presumably the army want chaplains to keep men in line, keep the morale up. Is there a conflict with that and taking their spiritual needs seriously?
I've had a few run-ins with senior NCOs. Once at one unit with officers, but generally never with the commanding officer. They want the padre to maintain integrity and to do what is right. And they want a man or a woman that they can trust who will go and see them and will be honest with them. The other thing is, I discovered this, that when you're in a regiment, the young officers go to Sandhurst and they go through the ranks together. And I was talking to a commanding officer's wife who I got very friendly with, and she was very lonely and quite distressed. And she had gone through the ranks with 4 or 5 other women whose husbands were the same rank as her husband. Then her husband was made lieutenant colonel. He's the boss. And he determines the careers of those other officers. And she discovered that if she said to her friends, like she'd done many times before, let's have a coffee, they would all turn up. They would all come. They didn't want to kind of have any dissension with her because it could affect their husband's career. That's how they perceived it. And she realised the only reason they come now is not because they're friends, it's because I'm the boss's wife. And she felt very isolated. And when she was talking to me, quite distressed. It was an interesting perspective that I hadn't seen before.
You seem to have 2 reactions. There were some officers, you had difficulty with your role, but the commanding officer not. Who did you report to?
In the army, you report, there's an officer designated in the brigade headquarters as DCOS, Deputy Chief of Staff, and so I would have a rapport with him. In the headquarters, it was the commanding, in the regiments, it was the commanding officer. One of the things that I decided early on, I would never go above the rank of the person I'm talking to and report them. So if I had an NCO giving me problems, I wouldn't go and talk to the commanding officer to sort it out. I would talk to him. I wanted them to trust me, that the senior NCOs, the sergeants, that they could talk to me and know I would not drop them in it. Generally, that worked.
In a normal parish, your parishioners are there, most of them, because they want to be there. In the army, they are forced to be there. Was that a huge barrier with the men?
You cannot order anybody to go to church. If the commanding officer wanted a parade service, he'd organise a barbecue, and he'd invite the regiment to the barbecue. By the way, we're having a parade service beforehand, and it would be lovely to see you there. So which soldier is going to disappoint his commanding officer by not turning up? And when they turn up at the church, they've no idea what to expect. At one regimental service, the commanding officer was brand new. And on the order of service, it said regimental collect. And 4 men had been designated to do the offering. When it came to the regimental collect, we were all praying, and suddenly you heard this real loud bang as all of them stood to attention. And they started trying to take the collection. And they didn't know the man sitting at the front because he was the new commanding officer. And one of them had a blue bag with the 2 handles. And he had his head down praying. And I was sitting here. And I saw this man walk to the commanding officer and tap him on the shoulder with a bag. It was very... And what I would do is I'd just have a kind of sermon, very different to what I would do here. And I'd ask rhetorical questions. They didn't understand a rhetorical question, so some smart guy would answer it, and then you'd have a rapport with them. And generally, it's enjoyable. It can get a bit fraught.
Another apostle, Peter, told the early Christians, always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have, which must have been a great opportunity for you, but also a great challenge, because I remember you saying, soldiers don't hold back.
I think I've said in the congregation here, we're too polite. I could go around with an naffy. If I'd done a parade service on the Sunday, and I'd be going around at 10 o'clock, and they'd be having coffee, and I'd have coffee with them. And somebody would just say, Padre, what you came out with, and I won't use the language, but he said, what you came out with on Sunday was an absolute load of... And that's a chance then, just say, well, why do you think that? And so we talk, and generally you get a group of people talking, and you let them do the lead, and then you try and work with what they've given you. You've got to have very thick skin. You know, it's if you're very thin-skinned in the army, I'm not sure quite how you cope with it. You probably leave very quickly. So,
you said you've been on operational tours in Northern Ireland, Kosovo, places like that. How does your relationship in those potentially dangerous situations, how does your relationship with the men differ?
You become very close to them. Yeah. On an operational tour, they haven't got alcohol, they can't go to the pub, they haven't got books or tapes. They are really quite in the barracks together, and it's a dangerous situation. And that's when they start thinking about things in a way they've never thought before. And they remember things that have happened in the past, and they talk. And if there's a death or an injury, it really kind of affects them. They realise it could be me. I walked in after the last soldier in Northern Ireland, Stephen Restrick, was killed at Besbrook Mill, and I was the senior chaplain for Armagh. And his padre had a nervous breakdown. And I went round the barracks one evening, and I went into one of the guard rooms, and the guard room is lit, and then there's a curtain, and you go through the curtain, and there's another curtain, and there's a sangha in which a guard is sitting, total darkness, looking out. And I went in and just said hello, and he was crying. And we just got talking, and he just opened up. I told him who it was. I'd never met him, he'd never met me, but he just completely opened up because his friend had died. And I stood in the darkness with him, and he really opened up to this man he'd never met about the grief, the sadness, the emotion. And I just said who I was, where he could find me if he wanted to, otherwise just leave it at that. And he never did come again. But actually, they will open up to the padre because they learn to trust. Mm-hmm. Get the trust, and then you can talk.
Recently, you've been preaching here on the whole armour of God, and there and elsewhere the Christian walk is presented as a battle, but Jesus told us to be meek, to be peacemakers, to turn the other cheek. How do you balance those emphases?
Meekness is not weakness. Meekness is the humility to accept somebody else's authority over you, even though they may not be entitled to it. And when you talk about peace, it's not peace where when the grandchildren have gone, you can finally sit down and relax. It's the peace that you have when you're standing in facing the enemy and you know God's sovereign. And when I talk to soldiers about these things, because they would pick up on this, the point I made to them was that actually we are in dangerous situations. I haven't got a weapon. and I'm not going to rely on them to defend me. And they can't understand that. You know, how you can't possibly trust this. But actually, I talk to them very honestly. I talk about my weaknesses, the questions I have that can't answer. I'm not afraid to say I don't know. And generally, man to man, you can have some good conversations.
After, I think, 16, 17 years in the army, you went back into civilian life to a circuit on the right side of the Pennines, this time in Merseyside. Was that a big decision?
I did a job at the Headquarters Land Command in Salisbury, which is the headquarters of the army. And the chaplain is the only chaplain in the army not under the command of the chaplain general. He's under the command of the general, the commanding officer. And I was there for 3 years. It was the Second Gulf War. And it's a really intense admin post, and I hate admin. And I had I had 2 secretaries shared working with me, and it was just admin from the moment I arrived to leaving. I left there and I went to York, and it was another admin post, and I'd had enough. And I went home one evening and I just said to Catherine, I think it's time to leave. She got so excited. I actually expected her to start arguing that I should stay, because the army pay was 3 times the stipend, well, 4 times the stipend. And I thought she's going to argue like mad, but she got so excited that actually I just handed my resignation. You have to do 1 year after resigning. And actually everybody said to me, you're going to miss it. I don't think there's been one day when we look back and regretted it. I drove off the barracks, having handed in my ID card, which means I couldn't get back in. Gone. We moved on. So you're back in Merseyside, but then 10 years ago you came to Otford, about which you knew absolutely nothing. So why were you here? When the Methodist Church is advertising jobs for ministers, and they're doing it at the moment, you get an A4 sheet on which you have to do a profile of yourself, and a profile sheet of the appointment that they're looking for. And that's all you get, 2 sides of an A4 sheet. And I had a book of churches, it was like that. And I meticulously read them all, and I was bored. There was nothing in any of them. Because they use words like exciting, prospect, blah, blah, blah. And you think, well, if it's so exciting, why is the minister leaving? And if it's great prospects, why are you not doing it already? And Catherine started to panic because she could see the way I was working that I was going to quit. And so she started going on the internet and looking at churches. And she found Otford, and Kath Paulett, who was here, was doing a baptism. It's when the old church was there. And there were 4 people being baptized, 3 teenagers and Abigail. And they gave the testimonies, and we watched it. And she came in my office really excited. You'll like this. You'll really like this. And I watched it, and I have to admit I was quite encouraged. And when I talked to my chair of district, he said, John, as soon as I saw that, I thought of you, but you were so adamant that you were going to stay in the Northwest. I didn't bother telling you about it. So we came to have a look at it. And we arrived one evening at Sevenoaks Station, and we were met by Helen Richardson. And I mean, we didn't know Otford. The only time I came through the southeast is to Dover. I'd heard of Sevenoaks, and I'd heard of Tunbridge Wells, but I didn't know anything about the place. And it's a long way from our family. But yeah, we decided to give it a try. You talked there about, I referred to the chairman of district and so on. I asked who you reported to in the army. I get the sense that the line of command in the Methodist Church has its own difficulties. You've got the ministers, the superintendent, the chair of district, conference. I've always been fortunate in that I've got on with my chairs of district. My previous superintendent, he said to me, the reason for that, John, is you intimidate them. No, I don't think I intimidate David, but actually I am fairly plain speaking. And I don't think superintendency is a promotion. It's a hindrance. And so I took this job because it's what was being offered. And I get on very well with the ministers, and I get on well with David and Helen. It can be a problem.
I came here to OOC 4 years ago, and I came to see you after many decades in 2 different denominations, and I wanted to see if you were happy for me to join you, and you were very warm and welcoming. But there's one thing you said I particularly remember. You said, you may want to be a member of OMC, but not of the Methodist Church nationally. I wonder in 5 years whether I would still be able to be a member of the Methodist Church. Has it become more difficult?
We have what's called living with contradictory convictions. So you believe this, I believe this, but we can get on together. Those who are in favour of the changes that have happened are very intolerant of those who disagree with them. We disagree, and we're not allowed to kind of publicise or speak without being criticised and hassled. At the moment, they know my views. They don't like them, but they accept them. And I think part of the tolerance is the fact they know I'm retiring. I don't know what would happen if I was going to try and find another circuit.
But in that, to an extent, do you then defend us when you go? Is that a problem for the church family here? Not long ago, in your absence, a preacher came who denied biblical gospel. Is that a price we have to pay for being part of a national church?
You can't pay that. You cannot pay that price. If you have a preacher in the pulpit who is denying the gospel, it needs the integrity to challenge them. And there may come a point when the wider church would say, you can't carry on. But to sit and listen to false teaching is in itself a sin. And we have to be discerning. We have to recognize, which is why we need to read the Bible. We need to recognize when the person in the pulpit is not preaching the truth. And you can only do that if you know what the truth is. And it's one of those costs that sometimes congregations have to do.
We pray in this church family for the persecuted church around the world, but you mentioned, it was an amazing challenge, you mentioned that they pray for us because they see us without their persecution as too complacent and liable to compromise.
They think we are the ones in danger. And what they're saying is, they're in danger from human beings, but our compromise and our liberalism is so serious, it's actually compromising and risking our salvation. Because by our behaviour, we are denying the person we claim to serve. And they're very clear about that. And it is humbling.
One of the various issues, one major issue recently obviously is same-sex marriage. A number of churches are departing from biblical teaching. They seem to be saying, oh, if it makes people happy, then it must be of God.
Well, there's really only one thing to say about that, isn't there? It's just being polite, it's rubbish.
Yeah. I mean, I have to say, some churches, especially in the US, not only are departing from biblical teaching about truth, but biblical teaching about love. And they're, particularly in the US, they're demonstrating, some of them, outright hatred of gay people. Now, you had to face this in your own family, this whole issue. How do you manage to balance a genuine Christ-like love for people, which you do, with upholding God's truth, which you do?
If you love the person, the balance comes automatically. If you love the person, you don't go in and start shouting at them or calling them names or abusing them. You love them and care for them and let them know honestly and gently you disagree with them. And in doing that, it may be that you show love and you have a disagreement, but actually at the same time, they know they can trust you. It's the love in that circumstances that will balance it. And love is hard. Tough love is telling people the truth, and that's hard work. And it can lead to tears, it can lead to all kinds of pain. But if you love somebody, you will not lie to them.
Would you, if a young Christian man or woman came to ask your advice, would you be happy to encourage them to go into the pastoral ministry?
When I said to my minister, Gordon, I feel God's calling me to the ministry, he said, well, we had a conversation, he said, go away and think about it for a year. And in less than a year, I went back and said, I think God's calling me. So, well, think about this. And I realized I was going to get this for the next 10 years if I carried on. And one day I just went to him and said, look, God is calling me to the ministry. And he's calling me to the Methodist ministry. I'd wanted to go elsewhere, but God made it clear. And at that point, he then accepted that I was called. But as long as I said, I think, he was happy for me to go on thinking. So. I may have, through the evening, sounded convoluted because I've always talked about pastoral ministry, but a couple of pastor friends of mine in the past have always said you shouldn't use ministry without a qualification because all Christians have a ministry and pastoral ministry is just one. But the implication of that is that since the Bible teaches every member ministry, we lay people also have responsibilities to teach the word, to be ready to give an answer, to serve people and so on. Do we lay people take it seriously enough? No. You let yourselves down. You want the minister to do the hard work, and you want to be comfortable. I'm sorry if this sounds like a blanket thing, but you want to be comfortable. You want to come to church on a Sunday, and you want to go home, and you want to have enjoyed the time in church. And yes, in the week you'll get involved in things, but actually the majority of people in the church, I'm talking here, the churches around here, the majority do very little, and a small number do everything. And as long as that's the case, it's very much weaker. We're told by Paul that every Christian is given a manifestation of the Spirit. We all have gifts. And every person here, sorry to be pointed, every person here has a gift of the Holy Spirit. If you don't know what it is and you're not using it, the church is suffering. It's when all Christians start using the gifts that they're given and being serious and responsible that the church starts to grow. And one of the gifts is love. That binds people together, but there's other gifts. And we need to be using them all. And I think a lot of Christians are frightened of using them because things might go wrong. I might make a fool of myself, which I have done many, many times. And there comes a point when actually you just laugh it off and get on with the next time. But I'm afraid I don't think Christians generally take it very seriously.
John, I've skipped over your life very lightly, and I know other people will have questions. We've got 2 microphones, so if you've got your question ready, if you can raise your hand, and either Sue or Fraser will bring the microphone to you. So, hands. No.
I can speak now. Oh, there we are. Just generally, in the army, were there presumably lots of ministers, pastors, whatever they were called, from different denominations? Did you all get together and have a jolly good pregnancy and everything, and kind of really work together? Or is it all very everyone working on their own?
Generally on your own. But when we did get together, it was quite interesting. I was line manager to a Hindu chaplain. And he came from Newcastle, and we had a big event where all the chaplains were together. And he was there with the Muslim, the Sikh, the Hindu, the Buddhist. And he came to me after a couple of hours and he said, John, these people don't believe. And he picked up that actually, when he got down to it, they weren't really believing. I don't know what he heard, but he was quite shocked, as was the Muslim. And I thought that was interesting. I did pray with them, but not big groups, small groups. And that was good. And yes, it was all denominations.
That's good.
He always has a question.
Actually, you always say to me, can you get a question?
I do, you're right.
It's been amazing the last 10 years. I think your preaching is just outstanding. When you look online at other preachers, I think you compare with all of them. But that's not my question. My question is, can you share with us moments of success and joy on the one hand, and regret and disappointment on the other hand?
There have been times when I felt I should have spoken out and I didn't. And I've walked away sometimes feeling a real sense of defeat and failure. And in the army particularly, it is a really intimidating environment. And on one of an operational tour, I really came to heads with some of the officers. And they made my life, they actually ostracized me because they really did not like what I was saying and the way things were. And when I left that barracks, they completely ignored me. And as I drove off the barracks, I had a really serious chest pain. I did think it was a heart attack. And it took some time before I could find peace with God to resolve that. Another one, in the army, they have a very clear system of marking each person for promotion. And one year, we had a chaplain who left the chaplaincy, became a school chaplain, and then came back. And they didn't deduct the years out of the army because the chaplain general wanted to promote him. And by accident, well, it wasn't, I think somebody actually deliberately let me see it, I saw the list, and I missed the promotion by 0.5 point, and he got it. Now, until that time, I'd said I'm not really bothered about promotion. I was driving home in the car, and I'm surprised the steering wheel didn't come off. I was so angry, and I was actually raging. I wanted to actually kill the person, seriously. I was angrier than I can remember ever being before. And that took me quite a long time. There came a point when I went off on my own, and I just sat down in a field, and I just talked to God about it, what was happening. And he began to deal with it. Now, I got the promotion eventually, a few months later. But I realized something about myself, an ambition that I didn't know I had. But those things have been the points when I've learned most about God. They have been the really formative times in my life, because that's the times I look back and I realize he started a work there that helped me deal with that. Times of great joy. Can you think of any? I feel, I mean, if you're working with a soldier who becomes a Christian, that is wonderful. If you're working with somebody who's gone away from the Lord and they come back because of something you've done, that's wonderful. Those are my times of joy. If you go to a congregation that's discouraged and struggling, and when you leave they're encouraged and they're really wanting to move on, I like that. Those are the kind. But it's always other people that give me that kind of joy. I can't really find it in things. I don't know if that answers the question, but I don't think.
Question here, answer.
John, thank you for sharing so openly with us this evening. We read regularly of the fragmentation within the Church of England, but the Methodist Church has a lower profile. It has been over a considerable period, and it still is the fastest declining denomination. Can you share with us your view, the direction of travel, and the prospects for the Methodist Church?
When I left college, there were 700,000 Methodists in British Methodism. There's now less than 180,000. And the age profile is such that within, I think it's a decade, that number will be vastly reduced. I put that down to the fact that the church has let go of the Bible and let go of God and thinks it can do better without him. It's not saying that, but that's what it's doing. And I don't think, as an independent congregation, it has a long future. I think it will either have to join with other congregations or just go into a gentle demise. A senior Methodist said to me recently, we were talking about this, and he said, we're just going to go the way of another church. We'll have lots of money, no members, and a few buildings. And I can't see any evidence contrary to that.
John, you've preached practically every Sunday for much of your life. As you move into retirement and take on the moniker of supernumerary, are you going to look forward to preaching, say, every other Sunday as well? Or is this going to be a real sit down, and what do you think of the future?
To be completely honest, I have absolutely no idea. I think some of the churches where we're going to will not want me in the pulpit. Because what I preach, they don't want to hear. When I left the army, I was asked to go and look at a circuit or a church, and I went knowing they wouldn't accept me because I knew the minister who was going to be the superintendent. And at college, we had disagreements which were quite aggressive. And I went in with Catherine and we were talking, and they asked me a question, what do you do about mission? And I said, for me, when you get one soldier converted, it's like throwing a big rock into a mill pond. The ripples just go out and have an incredible impact. And over lunch, the senior steward said to me, John, we find this idea of being born again very threatening. And they turned me down. And there's a lot of churches like that. They don't want to hear about being born again or repentance. And so I don't think the Methodist churches are going to be holding their hands up in glee that I'm arriving. And in fact, one minister of the supernumerary in the circuit where we're going to, the superintendent took him off the plan because he was too evangelical. So prospects for the church, see. So I don't know what's going to happen. I am confident of one thing. Even when I don't know the future, God is sovereign. And my experience of God is that he is always ahead of me. I have to be prepared to follow and not try to lead. And that's, so we just wait and see. So,
next one.
I spent part of the year in Kenya where there's peaceful coexistence between Christians and Muslims, and they both seem quite very strict, very convicted, very complicit in their own religions. How do you see developments in the UK between Christians, Muslims and Jews?
You have to add into that Hindus. And I was talking to a Hindu priest in Newcastle, and he said, my people are praying for the right-wing party because they are the only one that's going to control the Muslims. And if you have militant, then you have problems. And we seem to have quite a large number of militant Muslims. I heard a Muslim speaking a few days ago, and he was critical of those who were protesting in London because he said to them, you do not represent me. What happened on the 7th of October was evil, and you have no right to say you're representing Muslims. The Muslim community is divided, the Christian community is divided, the Jews are being threatened, and the Hindus are feeling very threatened by the Muslims. So I don't actually think we're going to have peace easily. I think it needs people in positions of leadership to work with that. But when you get Hindus praying for the British National Party, there's something not quite...
Any next?
I have to warn you, if you go 30 seconds without asking a question, I'll talk it gone.
I was interested in your concern about when you go to roast and you think people won't want to hear you. And first of all, they've got to hear you first, and, not just once, but a dozen times to see what your approach is. Secondly, why do you think that because people don't necessarily agree with everything you say, they still don't want to hear you? And one of the joys of Methodist services is you get different people putting slightly different emphases and approaches.
Because they've heard me and they haven't invited me back. I don't know if you've heard the name David Pawson, but sometimes he would go to preaching appointments, and when he went home he'd tell his wife Enid it was a double booking. It was the first and last. And because people sometimes, when they hear what you have to say, they don't want to hear it again. Now there are people who rise to the challenge, and I appreciate that. But if you have, as I've said, they stop one supernumerary because he's too evangelical. Well, actually, I know the man, and I think he's very, very ordinary. He believes the scriptures, and I think he'd be more subtle than I am. I think you've got used to me, so I'm perhaps not quite as abrasive as you used to find me. But when I first arrived here, one or two people were quite shocked at some of the things I used to say. So we'll see. I hope I do get preaching appointments. I hope I'm able to continue, but it's not something I'm worrying about. So.
Question.
Hi, John. John, one of the things I've always admired about you is how when you are describing the passage in the Bible, you always manage to put it in context with the historical context. And that always brings it alive to me. In particular, when you were describing when Jesus left when he was risen and the Nareen, I seem to remember, was it Nareen? That the bandages were around him and how sticky that was. That sort of detail really convinces me much more of the miracle of the resurrection. How important do you think it is to put the historical context into your sermons?
I don't think you can understand a sermon unless you have the context. An example I use is, everybody's heard about this speaker who's coming, and he's really famous, and they gather in huge crowds, and he stands up and he says there was a farmer went out to sow his seed, and some fell on the path and the birds came and ate it up, and some fell on rocky ground and it grew but then it died. Some grew amongst weeds and that was choked, and some fell on good soil and grew. And he stopped. And you hear that and you think, what on earth is this guy talking about? But when you get the context and you start to understand, you begin to see how it relates to us. But when you think of the people who heard him at that time, I mean, he was really challenging because he was making people think, what is he talking about? And context is everything. In fact, if you preach without context, people haven't got a clue what you're talking about.
I used to work with the evangelist Tom Rees, and he said, a text without a context is a pretext.
Yeah. That's it.
John, I thank you very much indeed for an insight into your life, and to Nick for the very challenging questions, for the sound best, for turning his word for you. And thank you so much indeed for coming. I think what we've done today is, John, although he's a minister, is a very bold man in his message. He doesn't hang back. And I think it's something that's happening in the church now, where there's so much indecision for guidance. And we thank you for that.
Thank you.
Can we close? Just wondering if we could go to close in prayer, please. Father God, we just thank you for this evening. We thank you for being with us in the Spirit. We pray, Lord, that you have spoken to each one of us, that we may take from here something that we have learned and put it into practice in our own lives. May we indeed be bold, be able to speak to others about the truth of the gospel. And we pray, Lord, particularly for this community and the churches in it, that you may be glorified. We ask all these things in Jesus' name. Amen.
I did prepare some pictures from North Wales for you to see, but I don't. Oh, all right. Some. We can. I can. I didn't put the... Can't hear. Little Orme is where I go walking. It's just 2 miles from where we live. And this is Llandudno. You can't see the words. The black's taken them off. Has anybody been to Llandudno? Oh, right, okay, so you know what it's like. I saw that picture and I thought that could be me and Catherine in a few years, so I just kind of put it on. You've been very patient. Thank you, and thank you for coming. You've surprised me by coming here. I have to admit, I was not expecting so many people, but thank you for coming. And, Catherine's smiling, so it can't have been too bad. Hello. How are you?
John, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Really good, thanks.